As soon as this boat gets to 60 feet, the scope breaks the water. I did a safety sweep. As I did that, instead of saying no close contacts, what I saw were two spotlights shining on the periscope. Emergency deep, make your depth 300 feet, down scope. And of course that woke the captain up and he came running in the control room. So we settled down to 300 feet and then we hear this banging on the hull. So I'm Tim Martin and went to high school in Las Vegas, was able to get a nomination and an appointment to the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. So a Las Vegas kid in 1963 went off to Annapolis wondering, oh, my goalie, what is this all about?
Did you always want to do that?
No, I wanted to have a good education. And my father was enlisted in the Air Force. And so he didn't have any money. And high school counselors really weren't very adept at that. But I learned about West Point and the Naval Academy, and the Air Force Academy was brand new. And so I applied and actually got an appointment to all three academies, because I think in Nevada there weren't that many kids that were trying to do it. And I had a math teacher, Mr. Deaton, George Deaton, bless his heart. And he called me in one day and he says, is it true you have your choice of the academies? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I am a retired colonel in the Army who attended VMI, Virginia Military Institute, the West Point of the South, the last school in the country to go co-ed. But as I look back, so Mr. Deaton had been an officer during World War II. And he's now a colonel, a retired colonel. And he said, let me give you some advice. He said, well, I got to be careful because probably West Pointers going to watch this. He said, if you go to West Point, they take the cream of the crop and turn them into second-rate engineers to go fight a war. So if you want to fight a war, go to West Point. He said, if you go to the Air Force Academy, you better be a pilot, because in the Air Force, there's pilots and everybody else. And I was already wearing glasses, so I assumed I was not going to be a pilot. And so Mr. Deaton, the retired Army colonel, says, if you go to the Naval Academy, you have more choices when you graduate, because you can drive a ship, you can drive a submarine, you can be a pilot, you can be a Marine, you can be a Marine pilot, you can be in the Supply Corps, you can be in intelligence. And that's how I decided. And even when we were many, many years later, I was a recruiter for the Naval Academy in St. George for 15 years. And I had some kids that actually had a choice of the academies, and I would tell them the same sales pitch. You had more choice. And for me, it worked out really well, because when I got to the academy, I was the class of 67, and they were just implementing majors. So prior to that, every class, everybody took all the same classes. You marched to class. And so our class, they said, you can pick a major. So one of the majors that we could pick was naval management, sort of like management. You took less math, less science, less engineering. I said, hey, I'm a talker. That's for me. So I signed up for that. And at the end of my plebe year, they brought a nuclear sub. Now, this is 1964. There couldn't have been 10 of these things. So they drove that in and parked it in Chesapeake Bay right by Annapolis for us to take tours so they could convince us that we wanted to be on submarines. And it worked, because we took this tour, and there's this Lieutenant J.G. who's 4 years out of the academy, and he knew everything about this spaceship. You know, we went to the missile compartment and the reactor compartment and the engineering spaces and the torpedo room and the control room. And I said, this is great. I said, how do I get to do this? And he said, just take all the math, all the science, and all the engineering. So I thought, well, I'm screwed because I'm in this management. But it turns out that the Naval Academy had a nuclear reactor, but that couldn't go critical. But Admiral Rickover, who was the father of the nuclear Navy, had graduated in 1927 from the Naval Academy He was a little scrawny Jewish kid that everybody picked on, but he was so smart that he made it. And he didn't really like the Naval Academy, so the story goes. And he said, you cannot have a nuclear engineering major. I'll train the nuclear officers the way I want them to be trained. So here the Naval Academy had a nuclear reactor, and so I took as overloads 2 semesters of reactor physics and reactor kinetics and engineering math, because now I knew what I wanted to be, and I discovered I was really good at it. So the Naval Academy was a very wonderful thing for me. And even after, I was able to serve in subs, and then when I got out of the Navy, my career was in nuclear. And so I'm forever indebted to the Naval Academy. This kid from Las Vegas who showed up saying, and I met classmates Joe Burns, and Joe said, well, how did you get here? And I said, well, Senator Cannon gave me an appointment. How did you get here? He said, I'm on a soccer scholarship. And I said, I didn't even know they had soccer scholarships. And then Bobby Burns walks up, another classmate of mine, and Bob says, yeah, I'm here on a lacrosse scholarship. And I'm going, I don't even know what lacrosse is. And he's here on a scholarship. So, you learn a lot of stuff. And it was just a wonderful experience. But it was because I just knew that I wanted to get a good education, and it turned out perfect for me.
How long were you there?
4 years. It's a 4-year college, and you can't be married. So my wife and I were dating in high school. We started dating our junior year of high school, and you can't be married. And so she went off to college at Utah State, and I went to Annapolis, and it was obvious that we were going to last for 4 years. So we planned on that. And then when I graduated, we knew we were going to get married. We didn't want to rush into it, so we waited 22 hours and then got married and lived happily ever after. It's been now 59 years. And in fact, in 4 days, we celebrate 59 years. And
wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Was there a boot camp-ish component?
There was. So when you got your appointment to the Naval Academy as a plebe, I reported 2 months before the brigade of midshipmen returned. So school started in September. We actually reported the end of June, and you had 2 months of what's called plebe summer, and that's where they taught you to how to wear a uniform and how to polish your shoes and get in physical shape and memorize stuff, so that if you ask me what time is it, I'd say, well, I'm, at a meal, you had to know all these rates from this book called Plebe Rates. And I would say, sir, I'm greatly embarrassed and deeply humiliated that due to unforeseen circumstances beyond my control, the inner workings and hidden mechanisms of my chronometer are such in accord with the great sidereal movement that I cannot, with any degree of accuracy, state the correct time. However, without fear of being too greatly in error, I shall state it's approximately 4 seconds, 19 minutes past 4 bells. And the bells part was the hard part, because you had to figure out, how many bells is it to go. But that was the kind of stuff you memorized during plebe summer. And then the brigade came back, and you're still a plebe, and you got harassed until usually 100th night. At the 100th days to go, 100 days before graduation, they kind of slacked off and let you lead a little bit more normal life. So,
did you enjoy that?
I did. I did. It wasn't fun. I mean, I still don't like, Midshipman Moriera, who was from Chile, and Midshipman Morse. They lived next door to me, and to Mike Bennett and I. And as they were first class, they were seniors, and we were plebes. And they set it up that if they banged on the wall once, we ignored it. If they banged on the wall twice, that was for me. 3 bangs was for Mike Bennett, Midshipman Bennett, and then all loud pounding meant we both had to go over. And so sometimes they would call and I'd run over there and they'd say, I want an ice cream bar. So I'd have to go get my money and go down to the basement, go to the machine. I mean, it was just nonsense, And but I said, hey, the end result is going to be, worthwhile, whatever we did. And if those guys can make it through it, I can make it through it. And so, yeah, it was, and the relationships you form, we're planning our 60th reunion from the Naval Academy, which will be next October. And, it's fun to get anticipating the reunion and being with our classmates that you've known that went through all this stuff for way back when. So, yeah, it was great.
What do you think drew you to the submarine?
Well, when they brought the boat in for us to walk on, for us to go on a tour at the end of my plebe year, I said, this is the coolest thing I have ever seen, and I want to do this.
What about it drew you to it? Just how technical it was? Or
well, I think it was just, probably the complexity, and, you're in this thing and everything. To have mastered something like that was really cool. And even in my later, when I had my own business, that's what I wanted. I wanted to be a guru, okay? I wanted to know enough. And so for me in the Navy, at the grand age of 27, I became the engineer officer on a nuclear submarine, okay, if you can imagine. And 60 of the 90 enlisted men work for me. And I theoretically knew more about that nuclear submarine than anybody, because the captain, the XO, and the navigator, the three senior officers, had never been an engineer. We were too new in the system. Today, the captains have all been an engineer. The XOs, the executive officers, have all been an engineer. But back then, that was a very unique thing. And so to know more, that was really fun for me. And that carried over even into my professional life later on.
As the engineer, what was your specific, what were you in charge of?
Well, I was in charge of fixing everything that broke. Okay?
Everything.
Everything, yeah. So the reactor and then the power plant, we had a big 8,000 gallon per day still, and that broke from time to time. I didn't have to do the sonar. Sonarman took care of that. The radioman took care of radio, but all the systems, so all the propulsion, everything, reactor apartment and aft, all the air systems, all the hydraulics, everything on the boat. Plus I'm standing watch, 6 hours on watch and then 12 hours off. And so in those 12 hours, I'm running a department. I've got 90 guys and 4 officers that I'm going to have to keep track of and train them and make sure that they're progressing. So it was a big job, but a small world, and I did really enjoy it.
Okay, so back up a little bit. What did you do after you got out of the academy then?
So when I got out of the academy, and I had to be selected for nuclear power. And in those days, Admiral Rickover, who was the father of the nuclear Navy, interviewed every officer. And there were stories about the terrible things he did, like the chair you sat on when you went in to be interviewed by Admiral Rickover, he cut the front legs a little shorter, so the seat you'd slide out if you weren't paying attention. He would say, are you engaged? And you'd say yes. Say, well, there's the phone. Call your fiance and break up because you don't have time to be engaged. I want you to be focused on your academics until you graduate. And I don't want you worried about getting married. And if somebody called, he'd say, well, you don't have the spine to be in my program. Get out, okay? So it was a fun and game. But everybody got interviewed by Admiral Rickover. I got interviewed. It was kind of anticlimactic for me because I had taken all these reactor courses and done really well, and so I wasn't too nervous about that. But I got accepted into the nuclear program. So when I graduated, we got married, and then I went to nuclear power school for 6 months, where you had 6 hours of academics every day and about 3 or 4 hours of homework every night. And that lasted for 6 months, and not everybody made it through that. Then I went to a prototype where they built a power plant on land to make sure that it worked. In my case, I went to the Nautilus prototype. The Nautilus was the first nuclear sub. The reactor in that sub was the S-1W. So it was a submarine reactor, the first one made by Westinghouse. Later, most of the boats had an S-5W, and the Virginia class, the newest submarine being built, one of which is the USS Utah, has an S-9G. So it's a General Electric reactor, ninth generation for submarines. So you had to go to the prototype, and you spent 6 months proving, getting checkouts and doing evolution, start up the reactor, bring steam into the engine room, start up the turbine, and manipulate the electrical plant to demonstrate that you could do all these things that you'd need to do when you got on the boat.
And that was in Idaho.
I was in Idaho for me.
And how many guys are in the program when you're doing that?
Well, the whole program, there were probably about 1,000 total people at the time. We had, I think, 14 of us officers in Idaho. And 2 of those guys didn't make it. They were not able to demonstrate and get qualified in time. And then after that, so that's the first year. And then we went to sub school, which back then was 6 months. Today, nuclear officers, their sub school is about 5 weeks, and it's really just a physical to make sure that they're okay. In our case, we spent the first month learning how to dive and surface a diesel submarine. There were 42 officers in my class, none of which were going to a diesel boat, but that was the program. And so we all learned how to dive and surface a diesel boat. Then we went out.
Hold on. What was that like?
Well, it was fun because then we went out for a month. I mean, at the end of the first month, we went out for a week, 5 days. I was on the USS Sea Owl, and we made 107 dives and surfaces. There were 14 candidate officers on this boat. And that's all we did for 5 days was make dives and surfaces, and they just played games with us. But it was fun because now when I see a World War II submarine movie, I know I'm able to say, oh, yeah, well, that's wrong, just like I would on a nuclear sub movie, because that's what my wife really likes. She really likes going to a movie with me about submarines, so I can tell her that would never happen, So then after the first month, we learned to dive and surface. The next month, we learned how to shoot torpedoes with World War II analog computer calculators, and went out and shot torpedoes for 5 days. And the interesting thing, so after the second underway, we came back into port, and I'd already been to sea once. The first time I'd really been to sea on this diesel boat. Second time I came home, and we could walk from the sub piers up to the married officers' quarters. So I walked up to the married officers' quarters and went to go in the back door, and the door was locked. And so I knocked, and I said, "Hey, I'm home." And my wife yelled out, "Take off your clothes. You stink," because we smell like diesel boats. And the clothes helped, but it's still, you still carry that.
If you were on a diesel sub,
you knew. And all the officers were coming back, and all their wives were saying, "Take off your," I said, "It's snowing out here." And she goes, "I don't care." So, and actually even a nuclear boat has an odor in port or at sea because of the chemicals that you use for the atmosphere control. You had this smell, and it's still true. I go aboard nuclear subs today, and I go, "Yep, that's what it smells like," So, but it was fun. So 6 months of submarine school, and then depending on where you stood, you got orders to go to an operating boat. So my orders were to go to the USS John Adams, SSBN 620. So going back to how many subs there were, so this was hull number 620 versus the Nautilus was hull number 571, so that's how many they built. And this was a Polaris missile, so we carried 16 rockets. The first time I saw the John Adams, it was in the shipyard in the dry dock in overhaul being refueled. So it was being refueled and would last. The refueling would drive this 500-foot long submarine in the ocean for 8 months every year. So it's constantly in motion. And it would last for 11 years, the reactor would. And the amount of uranium was a gallon. So we had a gallon of uranium is what we refueled the reactor with. Back in 69, we calculated that gallon of uranium cost about $58 million. Wow. So, and today, the USS Utah, SSN 801, will operate for 33 years and never refuel. But the sub cost about $4 billion, and $500 million of that is the reactor.
Wow.
Because that's what it takes to be able to make a device that can put out 230 megawatts for 33 years. So very sophisticated fuel and the whole system.
The first submarine you were on, describe it. Just kind of give me the details.
So it was the John Adams Lafayette class. So it was 450 feet long, and this is a non-missile carrying boat. But imagine there are extended here the missile compartment, and we could carry 16 Polaris rockets in 8 rows of 2. That was called Sherwood Forest. So each rocket is 31 feet tall. Each missile, Polaris missile, carries 10 atom bombs. So we had 160 atom bombs inside this submarine that we could take down to 1,300 feet. We really didn't need to do that. We actually never went below 700 feet, but you technically could do that. Had a crew of about 100 officers and men, probably 10 or 11, maybe 12 officers, and 31 feet diameter hull, because the rockets were 31 feet tall, but they had a missile hatch that made them poke up a little bit, but that was watertight too. So 31 feet. For contrast, the Utah is 34 feet in diameter. So it's about the same as far as big around. The Adams was, because we were never in a rush to dive like the old World War II boats. When I reported aboard after going to Annapolis for 4 years and then a year and a half of school, I report aboard the boat. And I'm worthless because I can't stand any watches. I can't really help. So what has to happen is you go aboard and you have to get qualified in the nuclear plant to be the engineering officer of the watch. And that means you have to get checked out on all the systems in the plant, the steam plant, the electrical plant, all the radiological controls. And that takes at least 6 months, maybe 8 months, depending on if the boat was operating or not. And our boat finally started operating. We finished overhaul. We went to sea so I could start up the reactor and do all the practical factors that I had to. So you get qualified as the engineering officer of the watch, and then you go up to the nose cone and you qualify as the diving officer, because an officer or a senior enlisted, a chief, would be the the diving officer, and so you have to learn how does the trim work, and how do you maintain a depth, and how can you tell when you're too heavy or you're too light or too much water forward or whatever, and that takes just a couple of months, and then you qualify as officer of the deck so you can drive. And that takes a while. That took another probably 6 months. So, and then you have to qualify as duty officer in port, so the captain can go home when you're finally in port and not worry about it. And when you get all done with that, then you have a qualification board where the captain and the XO and they get a couple other officers and they spend an hour or two interviewing you and an oral board to make sure that you're qualified and you get your Dolphins. So that's what's on this shirt is the Dolphins. The officers were gold Dolphins and the enlisted were silver. And then the tradition was that you would go to the officers club and the newly qualified junior officer would buy drinks for the other officers in the wardroom, and on the table would be a great big snifter, and everybody would get a drink, and they'd pour a little bit into that big snifter. And when the captain decided that there was enough alcohol in there, he'd take your Dolphins and drop them into the snifter, and the newly qualified officer would have to drink all this booze and end up with the Dolphins in his teeth. And when we were at sub school, there was an x-ray of a guy's stomach with the Dolphins in his stomach who had not been able to catch it. But because I was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in those days called us Mormons, the captain said, okay, Tim, here's the deal. We'll go to the officers club in Guam, and you can buy us all drinks, and you won't have to drink any, but you can drive us back to the boat because you'll be sober because you don't drink. And then we'll get the whole crew topside, and we'll announce that you're going to get your Dolphins, and we'll throw you in the water over the side of the boat. But because we're drunk, we're not going to throw you hard enough, so you're going to bounce off the tank top and then go into the water. That'll be fun, don't you think? And so that's what they did, and I got my Dolphins, but I would have done anything because that's the mark of, yeah, you're part of the community now. So
having done all that, was it everything you thought it was going to be?
Oh, yeah, it was. Yeah. It was great. I loved doing it. Unfortunately, you have to be away from home. And so by the time I finished 8 years in the Navy, serving on 2 submarines with a 2-year tour at the Naval Academy as a company officer between that, we had 4 of our 6 children, and my wife and I talked about it, and I loved it, but if I would have stayed in for another 12 years, I would have been underwater 4 years. Not all at once, but out of communication, out of touch. And as much as I loved it, we said, we're going to have to move on. And we did. And our life turned out great, but you don't know that at the time. So,
all right, give me some experiences. When you first got on the boat, what was stuff that stood out to you?
First got on the boat, we were in overhaul, so it was a little different because we weren't underway. We had steak and lobster for lunch every Friday, even in the shipyard, because submariners get more money for food, and so we ate really well, even in the shipyard. But I did get qualified, and so qualified as officer of the deck really early, and we were on patrol, my first patrol. So this patrol we lived in Hawaii. We would fly to Guam. There were 2 crews. The other crew would come back with, here's all the stuff that's broken. They would fly home. We'd fix all this stuff broken on the boat and get it all ready to go to sea. And then we would go out and submerge and stay submerged on patrol, ready to shoot our rockets for 60 days. And so on that first patrol, I was qualified to be officer of the deck. So I was probably 24, and I'm driving this giant monster, and it was cool, because I knew all there was to know. So one night, I had to come to Periscope depth. We didn't have GPS back in those days, but we could get a star sighting. So we had a Type 11 scope, it was called, Periscope, and it was connected to a computer, a very rudimentary computer back in those days. But we would come to Periscope depth, and the navigator, whoever was doing it, would sit on a stool that rotated, and the computer would point at a star, and there would be a crosshairs, and you had a joystick, and you'd move the joystick so that the star was right in the middle of and push the button, and that made a correction into the navigation system. And you did it 11 stars clockwise, and then those same 11 stars counterclockwise to take the gear error out. So you had to be at Periscope depth for about 45 minutes, and we did that almost every night. So I'm officer of the deck. It's 2:30 in the morning, and we're going to go to Periscope depth for a routine Type 11 fix. So what happens is you first come to, we would operate probably at 300 feet because that's plenty deep. Nobody could run into you, and you have sonar. You can hear, but you never went active. You just listened for the noise. And we were out in the middle of the Pacific, nobody around, 2:30 in the morning. And so I would come to Periscope or come to 150 feet and clear baffles because our only sonar was in the bow, a big sonar dome. And now the Utah, for instance, has 7 different sonar systems. Okay, we had one, and we had this sonar bow, and it couldn't hear behind us because it was in the front. Plus, that's where all the noise from the power plant was. So we had to clear baffles to make sure there was nobody back there that would run over us if we went to periscope depth. So you roll the dice, and it tells you you're going to turn right or turn left or do a circle or do something. And look behind you to make sure that there's nothing back there that's gonna hit you. So we cleared baffles. There was never anything back there, or there wasn't that night. And so we're all ready to go. The control room is pitch black, and so I called the captain and I said, "Captain, this is the officer," and I woke him up because it's 2:30 in the morning. "This is the officer of the deck. At 150 feet, I've just cleared baffles, have no contacts, request permission to go to periscope depth for a Type 11 fix." And of course, he said, "Yes, go to periscope depth for a Type 11 fix." And he went back to sleep. And I said, "Go to periscope depth, officer of deck I." And I hang up the phone and I tell the diving officer, "Make your depth 62 feet. And so he tells the 2 helmsmen and the planesmen, and they move their planes, and up we go from 150 feet to 62 feet, which was when I could see. And I slowed down to 6 knots so we didn't bend the periscope. And so as we head up, then there's a circular ring that I turn to raise the periscope. So I raise the scope, and the optics allow me to look up, and I knew the moon was out, so I was expecting to see a light up there. But you're looking around, and you're underwater, so there's a hydraulic assist to move the periscope. That's why you see officers with their arm hooked over the periscope as they're using that hydraulic assist. And you turn the optics up so you can see. And as soon as this boat gets to 60 feet, the scope breaks the water. I did a safety sweep. Okay, you lower the optics and you're looking level, and you do a 360 sweep. And as I did that, instead of saying no close contacts, what I saw were 2 spotlights shining on the periscope. And I said, "This isn't correct." So emergency deep, make your depth 300 feet, down scope. And of course that woke the captain up, and he came running into the control room. And I also had to put some rudder on so we wouldn't cut the trailing wire that we were using to receive our communications. And so we settled down to 300 feet, and there's a few other officers that got woken up by that maneuver. So we're all in control, and what do you think happened? And nobody was really sure. And then we hear this banging on the hull. And we said, "Well, Tim, you must have snagged a net somehow." So there was a ship up there, had their net out, and he was sleeping, so he didn't have his engines running or anything, and you captured it, and he's got glass floats on that net, and that's what's banging on the hull. And we can't have that, so we had to broach, come back up to periscope depth, and actually surface without opening the hatch, and send an enlisted man out to cut the net off. And he confirmed that I had, in fact, dragged something down. And, you don't know what was that attached to, okay? Was it a boat or what? But the big impact of all that was for the rest of the patrol. Every time I walked into the control room, somebody would go dun, 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 which was the theme song from the TV show called Dragnet. And which, Aaron and other young people has no idea what I'm talking about. Right. So I became Dragnet, okay? And we hope nothing bad happened from that. But that was my welcome to the real world, okay? And you just never know what's gonna happen. But it was very exciting. And and good place to learn how to drive submarines. And I was the assistant engineer, and then I was a communications officer, and then our operations officer got sick, and so I became the operations officer because I had qualified to be the engineer and was going to be leaving the boat, but I was a senior junior officer, so I became the ops officer for a while.
That long underwater, do people get stir crazy?
Well, no, I don't think so. Nobody ever did. I mean, nobody ever cracked, if you will. You're busy, and you're standing watch, 6 hours on, 12 hours off, assuming you're 1 in 3, that there's 3 other officers that are qualified. So I would stand a watch in the engineering plant as the engineering officer of the watch and be on watch for 6 hours, and then you get off and you eat a meal, and then you have a job. So as the assistant engineer or the radioman, I had duties that I had to attend to. When I was the engineer, I had a lot of stuff I had to do. And so you go, okay, I got 10 hours before I go back on watch. What'll I do? When's the last time I slept? And if I had a shower recently, and gee, I got all these forms I got to look at. So you're very busy. The officers and the crew show a movie just about every night. And back in those days, it was 16 millimeter. So these big boxes of 16 millimeter film, and all the movies were 3 reels. And you took as many movies as days you were going to be underway. So we would take about 70 movies. And where do you put those? Well, we put them on the deck in crew's berthing. So you walked on these movies, and that was not a problem, except no one knew what movie was where. And so if the crew showed a good movie one night, we would want to show that in the wardroom the next night, okay? And then you go, well, am I going to just chance it and try to find another one or what? And I remember Goodbye Columbus was one movie, and the star, the woman star, the female star, comes running out, and she looks like she doesn't have any clothes on and jumps into the pool. And that was, they weren't quite as risque back then, but if you were controlling the movie, you can back that up. So she comes out and jumps in the pool, and then she jumps out of the pool and walks back, and you can do that back and forth until you break the film, and then you have to splice it together. And everybody got pretty good at running the projector and splicing the movie. So for the good shots, that you knew existed.
Where did you project those?
I guess we had a screen in the wardroom for us.
But
yeah.
Could everybody that wasn't working could watch it? It was
not if you were a nub. Okay, if you were not qualified, then you didn't watch movies. Okay, once in a while, if there was a good movie, then the captain would say, "Hey Tim, you're not qualified, but why don't you come and run the projector for our movie tonight?" Okay, and so they did that once that I remember, and it was one of those bad movies. And it's 3 reels, and so you show the first reel, and then everybody goes and gets a Coke while you rewind the reel. And so I did that, and it was so bad I skipped the second reel. I just put the 3rd reel on, and nobody noticed. And it's true also for the enlisted. They showed a movie most nights, but the non-quals did not watch the movie until you got your Dolphins. You didn't, that didn't work.
You said when you'd come in and you'd do fixes, what was common stuff that needed fixing on the boat?
Well, a lot of maintenance work, so a lot of preventive maintenance. So pumps had to get checked, everything had to get greased. You had machines that broke, and you could put a temporary fix on it, and you had to go back and make sure that it was right. You hadn't run the diesel at all. We had an emergency diesel on every boat, so that if the reactor scrammed, you could run the diesel. You come to periscope depth and snorkel, and so you had to run the diesel and make sure that worked. All this equipment, all had to be maintained through preventive maintenance and make sure you didn't have any sound shorts. And so you had a big long list of all the equipment that you had to make sure was operating properly, and plus all the new crew, plus those who had been there for a while that weren't qualified, well, they're trying to get their practical factor. So they have to turn equipment on and turn it off. And so it's a busy time, even when you're in port trying to get out to go to sea.
And are you usually in constant communication, or the ability to be in constant communication?
When you're at sea, yes. You know, the Polaris boats, the missile boats, even today, when you're on patrol, you're in 24-hour continuous communication. If for some reason you lost, like if we cut the wire, we would have to come to periscope depth and raise the periscope because it had a radio receiver until we could string a new wire. On the fast attack, which didn't carry missiles, we went out and chased the Russians. Okay, that was my second boat, the Permit, SSN 594, Steely-Eyed Killer of the Deep. Okay,
and what was the name of it?
The USS Permit.
Okay.
Early on, they named the submarines after fish, so the Permit is a fish.
Okay.
Later, they named them after states and cities, and somebody asked Admiral Rickover how come he stopped naming the ships after fish and started naming after cities, and he said, well, fish don't vote. And so that's why we name them after the cities, because we want to support that. And that's why the USS Utah is named after a state, so that the people here will feel some allegiance to that. And I'm on the commissioning committee, and it's fun to go talk about the USS Utah with people here in Utah. So the new boats and the fast attacks, even back when I was on the fast attack, you don't need to stay in continuous communication, but you had to get the broadcast. All the messages are sequentially numbered, and you had to make sure you had all of the messages. So that meant you had to go to periscope depth about every 6 hours, certainly no longer than 8 hours, and you would come to periscope depth, and the radioman would tell you as the officer of deck that he'd copy the broadcast, and if that's the only reason that you were up, then you could go down. But usually when you went to periscope depth, you also blew the sanitary tanks, okay? Because all the bathrooms for the officers and the enlisted, they dump their waste, and all the wastewater, washing dishes and showers and all of that, all went into sanitary tanks, which were not pressurized. And then when you went to periscope depth, the outside pressure was lower than it would be at, say, 300 feet. So you could block off all the toilets and showers and tell people you're going to have to wait. And you pressurize the tanks and blow the waste overboard. And so that was usually once a day we would blow sanitaries. We also had evolutions back in the nuclear plant. You had to flush out the water in the steam generators. So you would blow the steam generators, and that made a lot of noise. So it depended on what you were doing, if you were following someone. For instance, we followed a Russian submarine for 38 days. And during that time, we had to be very careful. You know, when did you blow sanitaries? And we'd have to pull away and go away far enough that Russian sub couldn't hear us if we had to blow down our steam generators or something.
What's that distance?
Well, we would follow usually about 3,000, 4,000 yards, which is a mile and a half, maybe 2 miles. And you could hear them fine. They were not very good back in those days. And so that was plenty far away to be able to hear. And if you had to blow sanitaries or blow down the steam generators, you would pull away probably 7,000 or 8,000 yards. So maybe 4 miles. And that meant you had to speed up a little bit to catch up again. To be able to, be in position.
And you knew they didn't know you were there because
we knew that they didn't. That's right, because they never changed their routine. For instance, not disclosing any super secrets, but I mentioned as the officer of the deck, I had to clear baffles, for instance, before I went to periscope depth. We also had to clear baffles if you're just driving along because you can't hear behind you. So I, as the officer of the deck, I used dice. And I'd roll one dice, and that would tell me to turn left or turn right or do a circle or a Williamson, which they called a crazy Ivan, but it was really a Williamson turn. And that was random. And then I would roll the dice again, and that would tell me how long until I had to clear baffles. So it was totally random. When we followed the Russian submarine, they didn't do that. And you could predict what they were going to do. So I would be the officer of the deck, and sonar would call me, and they would say, con sonar, Igor just took the watch, and in half an hour, he's going to turn right. Because they were so predictable that the sonarman named the officers of the deck. And they knew they were on a rotation. And when Igor took the watch, he would have a cup of coffee, and then he would turn right to clear baffles. And so if I'm the officer of the deck, I'm driving along 3,000, 4,000 yards behind him. Sonar would say, con sonar, target is slowing or a change. And I'd just go all stop, and we would just sit there while he did his thing. And then he'd come back to base course, and we'd come right back behind him, and off we would go. And we know that they didn't know we were there because they never changed their routine in 38 days. Plus, the reason we were following them was it was the newest Russian missile boat. And they were going from Petropavlovsk, where we picked them up, down to the Southern Pacific, where they had a test range. And so our job was to be there with all of our antenna up when that rocket launched, and we did. And so they launched their newest rocket, and we had all of our antenna up, and we were able to capture all kinds of stuff. We actually had two spooks, we called them, two enlisted men. They were civilians, actually, that their job was to collect intelligence. They both spoke Russian, so if there was ever any communication that was over the radio, they could tell that what it was and interpret it. And the funny part of that was many years later, probably I'd been out of the Navy 12, 14 years, and I was living in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and I was in a racquetball tournament or league, and played racquetball, 2 or 3 times a week with the same guys. And this one guy, Larry, that I was playing racquetball with one day, it came up about submarines. And it turns out he was a spook on my boat, not for that, but for another time. But, they kept to themselves, and they ate in the crew's mess. And but I was the engineer in the spook shack. They had their own little shack full of electronic stuff. And the only people allowed in there were those two guys and the captain and me. And I, as the engineer, I never even went in there because they never needed me to fix anything. So,
what department were they under?
They were on their own. The captain knew what they were doing, but nobody else did. So,
were they Navy or were they something else?
They were civilians that were hired.
Civilians. I see. They were
civilians hired by the Navy.
I see.
Probably worked for the CIA or somebody. I don't know.
Okay, the attack sub, what did you have? You just had torpedoes on there?
We had torpedoes, had nuclear tips. So you had conventional torpedoes and you had nuclear. That was a problem because at one point we had orders. We were operating in the Western Pacific for 6 months. So we were home ported in San Diego, and they said, okay, we want you to go to the Western Pacific on a Westpac, it was called, and be gone for 6 months and follow these Russian subs around. So we did that, and in the middle of our cruise, we got orders, go into Japan, pull into Yokosuka. So this is 1974, not that long after World War II, that they had forgotten about nuclear weapons, and there had not been a U.S. Navy ship in any of the Japanese ports that had the capability of carrying a nuclear weapon. And so we were going to be the first. And we were pulling into Yokosuka, and we didn't say that we had nuclear weapons, but we had the capability to carry nuclear weapons. So we headed in, and then we got a message, nope, don't go, turn around. So we went back, and we circled for a couple of days, and they said, okay, we're all set, go back in. And so we did that 3 times. And finally, we pulled into Yokosuka. And as we pulled in the channel, headed for the shipyard, all kinds of helicopters and TV cameras, and everybody was, this was a big, big deal. And so we pulled in and we shut down the reactor, and we were staying in the shipyard just to make a visit and fix stuff that was needed. And so one night, after we'd been there a few days, the captain and the supply officer and I went to dinner in our civilian clothes. And when we came back, they were having a parade. The Japanese were having a big parade right in front of the shipyard. And so we couldn't get across. I mean, it was just kept going and going. And finally we cut through this marching group or whatever it was. And we got to the main gate to go into the shipyard. And there's this Marine officer with his guns. And we looked over, and here's hundreds of Japanese policemen with shields, and we came in, and this Marine officer looked at our ID cards and said, "Yeah, you're okay. You can come in." And we said, "What's going on out there?" And he said, "Well, you took your life in your hands because they're having a big anti-nuclear demonstration." He said, "That damn submarine, if I ever see any of those guys, I'm just going to throttle them on the spot." We said, "Oh, yeah, we don't blame you. That's a lot of trouble that's been created," not knowing that he had the XO and the engineer or the captain and the engineer. So, but it calmed down and life went on. And of course, now Japan is embracing that, and that problem went away. But it was a fun time.
What was kind of the deal? Were the Soviets tracing you guys? Do you have those stories?
I think not. In fact, when the Russian sub came out that we were going to follow, it was the newest Russian missile-carrying submarine. So it was as quiet as they could get. And they really hadn't mastered being quiet in the 70s. And even in the 90s, they finally had a couple of boats that were very quiet, but they were one of a kind. And today, they don't have very many. We have a lot more nuclear subs than anybody else. But we got orders saying, "Hey, this sub is going to come out of Petropavlovsk, which is up by Alaska, and we want you to pick up the trail and follow it down to the launching point." Well, they did the same thing we did. When our Polaris subs got underway, we like to have a fast attack follow them for a while to delouse them, it's called, to make sure there's no Russian sub following them. And we anticipated the Russians would do the same thing. They would have one, and in this case, they sent two fast attack Russian submarines following this guy when he came out. And we heard them all, and we knew what they were, and we just stood back and watched them all kind of go by. And one of them only stayed with him for a day or so, and the other one probably 3 days. But they made so much noise that we were able to maneuver around and then pick up position, pick up station, and follow the Russian sub without any problem.
And the way you keep from hitting stuff under the water is the sonar?
Well, yes, the sonar tells you what bearing he's at.
Or radar.
Well, you don't have radar.
And you're bouncing something off to know if there's rocks and stuff.
Well, no, because the ocean is so deep in the Pacific, you didn't have to worry about that. And you can't submerge in water that's less than 100 fathoms or 600 feet. So I always wanted to be on the West Coast because I get seasick. And a submarine on the surface rocks. And when it starts rocking, that round hull, it just keeps rocking. And everybody gets seasick. And for sure, I would get seasick. If you are on a submarine on the East Coast out of New London or out of Norfolk, you have a transit to get to there's a continental shelf. So you have to drive on the surface for 6 or 7 hours or 8 hours before you reach a dive point, and that's rocking and rolling. Where on the West Coast, the shoreline drops off into deep water that there's lots of places you can throw a rock from shore into water that's 3,000 feet deep. So as soon as we could get underway and rig topside for dive, we were down and we didn't rock and roll. If you're at 300 feet, it's nice and smooth. So I always wanted to be on the West Coast so I didn't have to worry about getting seasick. And that was, that made it easy to get underway and to not have to worry about, being on the surface and somebody following you, because when the submarine came out and we were going to take station behind him, our sonar would tell us what bearing he's at. You never go active, okay? You never ping, because it makes too much noise. And if you pinged, then for sure they knew you were there. And you only did that as a last resort. If you were in war, for instance, in the Hunt for Red October, they pinged to let them know we were here, or you would ping to make sure that they were within range, okay? Because our torpedoes could go 40,000 yards, 20 miles, and they had a wire attached, so you could steer it, and all you needed to know was that he was close enough that I could shoot him and the torpedo would get there. When we were following the Russian sub, you didn't follow directly behind him. You made sure he was off to the right or the left, and you never were at the same depth, because they would be at 50 meters or 100 meters, and we knew that how many feet that was, so you never went to that depth. We would make sure that, so if he stopped or did something and we crossed paths, we'd have a depth separation that would keep us from bumping into each other.
That's always blown my mind about subs, because you can't see anything.
Can't see it, right?
You're just down there floating blind.
That's right. Well, you could hear them.
Yeah.
And if we picked up a contact, like if we were just driving along and we picked up a contact, you know where he is, but you don't know how far away he is. Is he 1,000 yards or is he 40 miles? And the ocean will actually, because of the temperature, will bend sonar waves. So you can get a convergence zone, and we might pick up a contact that's 30 miles away, and it sounds like he's 5,000 yards away. And so what you have to do is maneuver. Back in the old days, you would have to get a good track, so you had a good bearing, and then you would change course, and you could then get another bearing, and you could triangulate, and that would tell you how far away he is. Today, the subs like the Utah actually have a sonar system with 3 sets of hydrophones along the hull, and they just turn sideways, and the difference in distance between those 3 hydrophones is enough that it can geometrically tell you what the range is to whoever it is that you're wanting to get a distance on. So it's come a long ways, and they have a trailing wire that they use, and that's much more sensitive than that bow sonar that we had. And they have a chin sonar, because the new subs today are going to do more work up close, launching seals. And all we had was a bathymeter to tell us how deep the water was right below us. Well, now they have a chin sonar that's much more useful when you're trying to operate in shallow water. They also have an under ice sonar, and we couldn't go under the ice because 1, we didn't have under ice sonar, and 2, our fairwater planes were right here on the sail, and so if you go up under the ice, you're going to break those off. These later, some Los Angeles class boats, they could turn those sideways, so they're vertical, and they would break through the ice. But we actually went under the ice before we picked up that Russian sub out of Petropavlovsk. Somebody suggested, the ice isn't that far away. Why don't we drive over and go under the ice so we could say we've been under the ice? And so we did that. And so I've been under the ice, and but just so we could say we were there,
Did you have any emergencies while you were out there?
We did, yeah. So the Navy has lost 2 nuclear submarines, have sunk. The first one was the Scorpion. The Thresher. The second one was the Scorpion. The Thresher was lost in 1963 as I was on my way to the Naval Academy. The Scorpion was lost in 1968 as I was on my way to submarine school. So those are both very real to me. The Thresher, the first nuclear sub to get lost and to sink in 1963, was hull number 593. My boat was hull number 594. I was the same boat as the Thresher. What happened to the Thresher was they were doing some tests just coming out of the shipyard, and they had to go down to test depth, which was 1,300 feet. While they were there, they got a major seawater leak that they couldn't isolate, and they tried to make it back to the surface, but they didn't make it and went down, and when exceeded crushed depth, the hull collapsed and 129 men were killed. When I was the engineer, we had to replace the periscope because it was leaking. So I, as the engineer, either have to write a test procedure to pressure test the ops compartment with all of its connections to the ocean, or we could go to test depth 1,300 feet. And so I told the captain, we're going to 1,300 feet as we came out of Pearl Harbor, where we replaced the periscope, or Guam rather, and because we'd done it half a dozen times since we'd come out of the shipyard. And he said, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. So we came out of Guam, and we had a whole bunch of things that I had fixed in addition to the periscope. And we went down to 1,300 feet, and I had to, in order to clear that everything was right, I had to take a flashlight, and while we're at 1,300 feet, make sure that that seal on the periscope wasn't leaking, okay? So we did that. We went down to 1,300 feet, and I took my flashlight. And just after I finished that, a flange back in the engine room blew apart at 1,300 feet. So we had the same accident, which was a major seawater leak on a 6-inch air conditioning ASW pipe at 1,300 feet, and it blew out. There's an O-ring, because when you put the pipes into the submarine, you can't put them all in at once. And so you put them in sections, and where they come together, you have two flanges. And in the shipyard, this flange had 14 bolts, but they only put nuts on 12 of the 14 bolts. So the two outboard bolts didn't have nuts, but they then covered it with insulation because the cold water, you don't want it to drip. So no one could see that until it blew out. And so back aft, they heard the bang, and the next thing, a wall of seawater started blasting from the overhead down, because the water blew out and followed the frame bay all the way around till they hit a vertical and then came shooting down. And because of the Thresher, they had made a sub-safe system. So our boat had some things that the Thresher didn't have, and the engineering officer of the watch, Rick Bayshar, who I had just qualified because I'm the engineer, I said, yep, you're qualified to be the EOW, the engineering officer of the watch. So when that happened, he reported flooding in the engine room and had 4 toggle switches, and that shut all the valves in the engine room. So that stopped the flooding. But we still got a lot of water in, and it destroyed a 400 cycle set for the sonar, and everything that used seawater got screwed up. So we had a lithium bromide air conditioning system, and it rocked up, and the 8,000 gallon per day still that made all the fresh water, it stopped running. And, so it took a long time to get everything back, but we lived to fight another day. And
were you nervous? Pretty nervous when that happened, or no?
No. I slept through it, because I had been trying to get the boat fixed enough that we could get underway, and I'd been up for about 3 days. And when I got the periscope verified and I signed off on the red tag to say we were good, the captain said, "You look terrible. Go lay down for a minute, because we're there. Everything is done." And the next thing I know, the captain is shaking me, and he says, Ange, you missed it. You missed it. And so he then told me, and I ran back aft and saw the chaos that was back there. And because we had done an emergency surface, and I'd slept through that too, and as the engineer, for instance, we were very concerned with keeping all the water systems in specifications. You have a water system for the reactor, a water system for the steam generators, a water system in the engine room. And so to keep everything in spec, I had a phone right by my bed, in my bed. And so they could ring me and I could answer the phone while I was in bed. And I got a phone call every 4 hours for the whole 6 months that we were underway. And they would tell me what the boat was going to do. We're going to come to periscope depth. And we had old steam generators and chemicals would come out of solution. And so it was a game. And if you went out of spec too many times, you had to report that to naval reactors and they would then get upset or whatever they did. So in any case, it didn't bother me. You know, I never worried. In fact, people would ask Deanna, do you worry about something happening when he's at sea? And she'd say, no, because he doesn't worry about it. And I didn't, you know, I knew how that boat was all put together and I didn't worry about it. You know, it's pretty amazing. I've taken groups on tours of other submarines since I got out of the Navy. And the biggest surprise is I walk through the officers' country and I look at that stateroom where I lived for 6 months with 2 other guys, okay? And you have 3 bunks against the bulkhead that have a curtain, so you have some privacy. And then 2 fold-down desks and a fold-down sink. And if somebody's sitting at the desk and you're trying to get to your rack, your bunk, they have to stand up because you can't get around them, okay?
Right.
And I lived there for 6 months, you know, and I go, wow, that was really a small space. And it's still small even on the new boats today. So
when the submarine is diving down, going to 1300, is it creaking?
Yes, it creaks.
So that is like in the movies.
Yeah, that is like in the movies. When you're at periscope depth or even on the surface and you start changing depth, the boat pops and creaks, and if you're not used to it. And what's happening is all these metals that are, like, for instance, back in the engine room, it's really bad because the whole power plant is on a floating bed plate. So it's got sound mounts keeping that plate. But things move against each other because the hull is compressing. When we were going to go deep, and the crew knew it, especially in the engine room, they would tie a rope across the engine room from one side to the other, and it's taut, it's tight, and it's level. And as the boat goes down, the hull compresses, and that rope would then slack. If you're the diving officer and you're on the surface and you're going to go down, you go to 150 feet and you get what they call a trim sat. So you're satisfactory trim. So if you were to stop, then the boat would just sit there. That's what a trim sat means. And so then you tell the officer of the deck, I got trim sat, and you can now maneuver. And if you go down to, say, 300 feet or 400 feet, the boat creaks and pops and snaps, and because the hull is compressing. And if you're the diving officer, you have to pump some water out, because in order to be satisfactory trim, it means that the boat weighs the same amount as the water that it displaces. Well, if you then go from 150 feet, say, down to 700 feet, which was very common, the boat compresses. And the boat now weighs the same as it did when you were at 150 feet, but it's smaller, so it displaces less water. So it weighs more than the water it displaces. And if you're not careful, you know, you're going to be heavy overall, and that means you got to pump some water out to get back in trim. So that's the way it works. Yeah. The other thing we would do is when we would get underway, especially on the Permit, the fast attack, I would have, if we'd been in port, say for a month, or we're going to be underway for a week or two or something. So as soon as we got underway, we'd dive and get a good trim sat. And then I would invite anybody who was new, especially new to submarines, but even new to the Permit, to come into the control room. And I would be the officer of the deck, and I would say, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen to this submarine right now? We're at 150 feet or, say, 300 feet. What's the worst thing that could happen? And they wouldn't know, but I would ask one of the crewmen, what's the worst thing that can happen? And they'd say, well, if the stern planes, okay, all the way back aft, because you have stern planes controlling your up and down, if the stern planes failed on full dive so that the boat would keel over and head down and no way to raise them, I'd say if they failed on full dive, that would be the worst thing that could happen. And I'd say, okay, well, let's do that. So I would say, ahead 2/3, and we're at 700 feet. And I'd say, diving officer, put the stern planes at full dive. And he'd put them at full dive, and the boat would keel over, and it would get to a 30 or a 40 degree down angle. And after it's done that, on its way down, I just tell the diving officer, ring up back 1/3 and slow the boat down, okay? And if we had a trim sat, okay, then eventually the boat would slow down and maybe even stop. But as it did that, it would level out because it's satisfactory trim. So it wants to be level. And you may have to come to all stop, but that's what would happen. It would stop and you'd be level. And I'd say, see, that wasn't so bad. I mean, we might go down an extra 400 or 500 feet, but here we are, and everybody lived to fight another day. The other thing I would do is I would say, let's go really fast and see what happened, because those angles and dangles would show everything that's loose in the boat. So everybody who had put their books in the lockers and all this stuff, well, I want it to come out now before we were in a situation where that could cause a problem, especially in the galley where they weren't taking care of the plates and stuff like that. So angles and dangles were really an important part of getting underway to make sure that you didn't have loose stuff that was going to bounce around. But the fun part was we would get going flank, and even on the Permit, we could go over 30 miles an hour, probably 35 downhill with the wind, okay? And then you would give it a full, like left full rudder, and as you start to turn, the hull, the momentum would rock the boat outboard. So you would rock away from the turn, and now you're sliding and the water hits the sail and it makes it turn in. So you do a snap roll. So you're driving along and you'll rock out about 20 degrees and then rock in about 20 degrees. And, here on this giant sub, that's pretty cool. And when we would do the angles and dangles and get a 30 or 30 degree down angle, you can stand on the bulkhead, okay? You can stand on the wall, and that's always, pretty cool. So when
like an amusement ride.
Amusement ride. In fact, one of the movies submarine movie is called Hunter Killer, with Gerard Butler as the captain. And before they started making the movie, the director of Hunter Killer and Gerard Butler went for a ride on a nuclear sub to see what it was like. And the director said to the officer of the deck, now we're going to have a torpedo shoot at us. And what do you do when that happens? And the captain said, well, I'll show you. And because as the officer of the deck, you know how to react. So he said they were cruising along at about 400 feet or whatever. And you hear sonar, it goes con sonar, torpedo in the water. And so you have an immediate action, all ahead flank, make your depth 700 feet, left full rudder. And you're going to get out of there as fast as you can and figure out. And you also might do a snapshot if you were in a war situation where you shoot a torpedo right back down the bearing of wherever you heard that. And the boat tilts down, as you can imagine, because you're going flank and you're turning. And so the director said, well, we have to have the control room in this movie on gimbals, like you would have a airplane simulator.
Right.
And we have submarine simulators too in Connecticut at sub school, where you learn how to operate as diving officer by doing that. So in the movie Hunter Killer, they do actually get the right motion as they have to evade a torpedo. And that's really what happens. I mean,
how fast is a torpedo coming usually?
50 knots, 55 miles an hour. It's coming faster.
Fast.
You can't outrun it. Okay, they can't outrun ours, and we can't outrun theirs. But you can outmaneuver it. So So if you had a torpedo in the water and you were in a war situation, you would do a snapshot because you always have a torpedo ready. You have to open the outer door, but you can shoot a torpedo back down the bearing where that torpedo was coming from, and then you try to evade the torpedo coming after you. And that's true today, just as it was with the Permit back in the 70s. And so you have some decoys, okay, and it's really like a big Alka-Seltzer. And you can put that out, and that makes a lot of noise that may attract the torpedo. You can also, when you turn real fast, going like a flank bell, and you turn, you put a bubble in the water, because when you turn, the screw cavitates, where the pressure on the downward side of that blade gets so low, you form a bubble, and that bubble collapses on the screw, and that's called cavitation, and that makes a lot of noise, and it puts a bubble in the water. So that's another thing that you can do. And now they have, the newer subs actually have like a drone that they can put out that sounds like a submarine. And, wow. And that hopefully would fool the torpedo to go away.
You talked about the other sub that the other nuclear sub that sank. What was it?
The Scorpion sank in '68. It was on its way back from a Mediterranean cruise, and it's not clear what happened. Okay, a lot of theories. When I was at sub school, I reported to sub school just as the staff was coming back from the investigation, because when the Scorpion sank, they had the staff of sub school go out and try to figure out what had happened. And they took all the sound follow tracking and everything. And so they were all coming back to teach us sub school. And so it was not unusual for us to have a class that would say, okay, the instructor would say, today's lesson is on the Mark 48 torpedo, but let me tell you what I think happened to the Scorpion. And we would hear his theory. And finally, Cordell, he became vice president nuclear and then president of Philadelphia Electric. He was the commander of sub school when I was there. And one afternoon he got all the staff and all the students in the auditorium, and he said, I don't know what happened to the Scorpion, and neither do you. And when the chief of naval operations figures it out, he'll tell us. Until then, stop speculating on what happened to the Scorpion. They actually found the sunken Scorpion. Probably the most common theory is that they were doing tests of torpedoes, because you have to test, and the torpedo started, the engine started in the torpedo room, and it's a steam-powered torpedo, and it sends off lots of noxious gases as the engine is running, plus it can blow up. So, because it has a magnetic detector. So all the submarines have a device so that it can't circle and hit you, because during World War II, that was a problem. They'd shoot a torpedo and it would come back and hit them. So you have an enable distance, and you can set that. So typically it's 1,000 yards, half a mile. So if a torpedo goes out, it can't enable. The warhead can't become active until it's gone through the enable distance, so that if it circles back, it's not going to blow you up. Might hit you, but it's not going to blow up. And so if a torpedo lights off in the torpedo room, one of the immediate actions is to do a U-turn, because that would tell the torpedo, hey, we just did a U-turn and you should shut down because you're not at your enable distance. And the reason they thought that was because it looked like there had been an explosion of some kind. They couldn't tell for sure inside or outside, but the sub was pointed in the wrong direction. Okay, so it was headed home, but when they found it, it was pointing the other direction, which would say that they had tried to do a turn to shut the torpedo down before it had reached its enabling distance. But it's not clear, okay, what happened. And those are the only two, and that was many, many, many years ago. So, people, even now, I'm sure they don't worry about it any more than I did when I was driving the boats.
Tell me about the food situation on the boat.
It's great. Because on our boats, we were on watch every 6 hours. So watch changed every 6 hours. So the boat made 4 meals a day. So you had breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and mid-rats at midnight. And those who were going to go on watch came and ate, and then they kept the mess decks open, and the people coming off watch could then go eat. We in the wardroom, we ate the same food as the crew, but we had stewards who took care of us, and 2 or 3 of them, and they would go down and get the same food the crew was eating, but put it on a silver platter and bring it to us. And so we were eating formal meals, so to speak. And it was excellent. We had pizza. We had pizza night once a week because that was a big hit. We had a lot of beef, ate a lot of beef. When you got underway, the eggs went bad after, a week or 10 days. They tried putting them in plastic and all kinds of stuff, but and wax, but they just didn't last. And same thing with milk. We didn't have the heat treated milk that they have today. So after a few days, the milk was all shot. But we had a soft serve ice cream machine. And so I had a chocolate milkshake every day that we were underway. And the good news was we always had ice cream, because I had to make sure that baby was always working. If the ice cream machine broke, that was a higher priority than sonar, because people wanted their ice cream. But the problem with the ice cream machine was that the color of the ice cream, the coloring you put in it, was independent of the flavoring. So for dinner, for dessert, you might have apple pie a la mode. And so the stewards would bring the apple pie a la mode, and there is orange ice cream on your apple pie. And the question was, well, what flavor is it? Okay, because the flavor, it could be strawberry and be orange ice cream. So you also had, desserts were the only thing you could bet on the sub. So I went to the Naval Academy, and several times we were at sea for the Army-Navy game. Army is West Point, the Army Academy at West Point, New York, and the Navy is Annapolis. And so it's Army-Navy, and a lot of people in Utah don't know what Army-Navy is. Hard to believe, but it's true. And so traditionally in the wardroom, where you had maybe 10 officers, half would be from Annapolis and half would not. And so there would always be a bet on the Army-Navy game, and it was usually desserts, okay? Well, the last patrol that I was on the John Adams, we were at sea for the Army-Navy game, which was usually around Thanksgiving. And so I didn't want to lose the bet, and I'm the operations officer, and I'm over the radioman. So I went to the radioman and I said, before the game, Navy is going to win this game. And so I told him that whoever wins, because what happens is you get the messages, and then the submarine force keeps the broadcast going 24 hours a day. So there's always something coming. And if you're at war, it's war messages. If you're not, it's the news, okay? And familygrams. So to get the news, I said, okay, you're going to get the news of the football game, and I want you to adjust it, because it would print out on the teletype, but they could change it, okay? And I said, so whoever wins, if Army wins, everywhere it says Army, you change it to Navy, okay? And here's the Navy star, and you put him in that if somebody good did something, put this guy's name in. So Navy actually lost that year, but the radioman put out the broadcast, and everybody reads it, and Navy won. So I got all the desserts that I had bet, and so did my classmate or my fellow Naval Academy guys. And that was all fine until we came off patrol, and I thought, this could be bad, because the executive officer was really into this, and he'd gone to, I don't know, Rensselaer or someplace, and got a good degree. But he'd lost, and he'd lost to me. And I thought, oh, I don't know how this is going to go. But we'd been home for about 3 weeks in our off crew. So everybody had pretty much leave for the first month. And he had a party, invited all the officers over to his house for a party. And I thought, I'm going to really hear about it. And so we got to his house and we walked in, and my wife walked in first, and he said hi. And as I walked in, he goes, "Good trick, Martin." And, and so I thought, well, that's the spirit of submarines. But the food was great, and we had a cook on both boats. And at nighttime, they would make sticky buns and fresh bread. And so if you were the officer of the deck from the midwatch, midnight to 6, they often would bring up a sticky bun for the crew that was on watch. But we ate a lot of really good food.
You said you saw Apollo 13 lift off.
Yeah,
we were at
when we came out of the shipyard, the big test was does everything work? So the other crew drove the submarine out of Bremerton down to Cape Kennedy through the Panama Canal, and we all went to Hawaii to get housing. And then the other crew actually went out and shot a rocket, and these rockets are solid propellant, and they would usually take a rocket for the test that had a crack in the fuel or had some kind of a problem. So we were verifying that everything worked, and the Navy was verifying that those rockets would work or not. So we then flew to Cape Kennedy, relieved them, and they went out to Hawaii to find a house, and we went on our underway and went out and shot a rocket. But we were in port, and while we were in port, because we had just come out of the shipyard, the only two people qualified to run the engineering plant was the engineer officer and me. And he was lieutenant commander, and I was Lieutenant JG. So guess who got to spend the night on board the boat, because you had to have a qualified EOW on the boat every night. And I didn't drink, so they said, "Hey, Tim, you won't mind," And but one of the benefits was that we were at Cape Kennedy when all the Apollo missions were going, and they launched Apollo 13, which was a night launch. And so we watched it, me and somebody else, because we had 2 periscopes. We watched that sucker light off and launch through the periscope, which was pretty cool.
Okay, and just so that's great. When you're out, it's not like the Navy or anybody knows where you are necessarily. They kind of know a general area where you are, but they're in communication with you. Is that right?
You never broadcast, so you're receiving messages all the time, and you have an assigned area. They don't know where you are exactly in that area, but they know you're going to be in that area. And it's the same thing with when we transited. For instance, we did our rocket launch for Cape Kennedy, and then we drove up to Charleston, and we loaded out with 16 live rockets. Okay, so they loaded 16 rockets into our sub. Each rocket had 10 atom bombs. So we had 160 nuclear devices, okay, on our submarine. So that John Adams in 1969 had more destructive power than all of the bombs dropped in World War II. And there were 41 of us, 41 for freedom. They made 41 of these missile boats with this, the concept of mutual assured destruction, okay? We knew the Russians wouldn't launch a rocket at us because we could destroy them. And it worked, because there has not been an atom bomb set off in anger since World War II, since the 2 at the end of World War II. So it's worked, okay? And so we took those 16 missiles and back through the Panama Canal, had a swim call in the middle of the canal, because we were high priority, so we were the first boat to go through enter the locks for the Panama Canal. And Lake Gatun is right near the Atlantic side. So our guide said, the pilot said, "Well, you can enjoy this." So we had a swim call. So we stopped in the middle of Lake Gatun, and the crew got to jump in the water, and we had a barbecue, because suddenly this 55-gallon drum that had been cut in half appears up on the missile deck, and we're barbecuing steaks. And I remember talking to Paul Croy, the weapons officer, say, Paul, does it bother you that here is this barbecue at 2,000 degrees, 3 feet from your atom bombs? Does that bother you? Nah, it'll be fine. And it was, fortunately, but that's what we did. We had a swim call. And then we came through the Panama Canal and head to Hawaii. And on the way to Hawaii, there was a box that was 50 miles long and 20 miles wide that we could maneuver within. And instead of shooting the garbage, just like we shot empty the sanitary tanks, you would also shoot the garbage when you're at periscope depth, because you put them basically in a can with a weight, and then you had a small torpedo tube and you shot the garbage. Well, rather than do that, we would surface every day going across the Pacific for an hour or so and throw the garbage over the side. And I was OD, and we threw the garbage over the side, and a dozen sharks showed up. And so that night at dinner, I said, Captain, we should capture a shark. And he says, great idea, Martin. You're the shark control officer. So I went back. I was the M division. I was the assistant engineer, the main propulsion assistant. So I went back to my chief, the senior enlisted, Chief Colbath, and I said, Chief, we're going to catch a shark tomorrow. And he goes, I'm your man. So he went and got some bar stock, probably nuclear grade, and made a giant hook, with a barb on it. And then we tied a line to it, made it so he could tie a line to it. And the next day, the boat surfaced, and as many of the crew came topside as they could, and we threw the garbage over the side, and the sharks all came. And I took this hook, which had a big stake on it, a big stake, and I threw it over the side, and I'd run the line through a socket up in the top of the sail, So I throw the meat with the hook in the water, and the line is coming into the top of the sail, down through the sail, through the control room, through the navigation center, into the missile compartment. And there's 8 guys holding the rope in the missile compartment. So the hook goes in the water, the sharks all show up, a shark grabs this hook, and I yell over the 1MC to the whole crew, okay, run. And those 8 guys in the missile compartment start running with that rope all the way. They start running aft. Well, that hook went right through the head of the shark and pulled it out of the water, and I'd marked where it needed to stop. And so I yelled, stop, and we tied the rope off, and we had captured the shark because the hook had gone through its head. That's the good news. The bad news was it wasn't dead, And so the shark is hanging over the front of the Fairwater planes, and it's flopping around. And I said to the captain, I got the shark. And he says, okay, I'll take care of that. So he calls down to the control room and said, send the M16 to the bridge. Well, I don't even know we had an M16. But after a while, this rifle shows up on the bridge. The captain takes the rifle, climbs out of the cockpit up on top of the sail, and there's handholds to get down to the main deck. No life jacket, no safety line. Against every principle, but he's the captain, So he's down on the main deck, and he's underneath the Fairwater planes where this shark is flopping around, and he's going to shoot the shark. However, the captain hasn't shot a rifle in a long time, and he didn't remember that when you shoot a rifle, it goes up, especially multiple shots. And he hadn't checked, but the M16 was on auto. So what we hear is he goes down. We can't see him. He goes underneath the Fairwater planes, points this rifle at the shark, and we hear bing, 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 bing. And I'm saying the captain's dead because all these bullets are bouncing around. He goes, I'm okay. And then he puts it in single and empties the clip into the shark. And so by now, the back of our area is coming up because we'd been stopped for quite a while. And this box is 50 miles long, and it's moving at 16 knots. So you got 3 hours a little less than 3 hours before you got to get underway again. So I cut the shark down and we laid it across the bow and then took turns where we put our foot on the shark, holding the rifle, and somebody took a picture because that's really all that mattered. And we didn't have time to take advantage of having a shark. And
How big was it?
not that big, probably. Well, it was 5 feet.
5 feet.
It was big enough that it was hard to get it.
You still have that photo?
No.
Oh, man.
No. But that was
sad.
back in the day when you had film, and who knows where it went. But it's in here,
That's a great story.
and lived there forever. I was the successful shark control officer.
One last thing, because I don't think you ever addressed it, because I think people find that interesting. The guy that said, hey, we should do nuclear on the sub. Tell that story.
Admiral Hyman Rickover, at the end of World War II, nuclear power is now reality. There had been a reactor in Fermi, Enrico Fermi had built a reactor under the stands in Chicago, and that's how they knew that fission would work, giant thing with lead and carbon. And so there was a group formed of officers, some from the Army and some from the Navy, to say, what are we going to do with this? And Rickover was now in the engineering corps of the Navy, but had been in submarines. And he said, the optimal use of nuclear power is to make a nuclear reactor and put it inside a submarine. And nobody had ever built a nuclear reactor, much less put it inside a submarine. So I'm sure there were skeptics, but to prove the concept, before they built the first submarine, they said, let's build a power plant and see if it works. So out in the desert in Idaho, at the INL, the Idaho National Labs, INEL, experimental labs it was. At INEL, there's a building that they just tore down last year. And in that building, when you walked in, there was the aft end of a nuclear submarine. It was the hull of the Nautilus. And instead of a screw or a propeller, it had a water wheel. And around the reactor compartment was a tank, which was the shielding that the ocean would provide. And Rickover, plus a lot of really smart people, had designed this reactor and the reactor system that would be able to power a submarine. And so in 1952, they started up the reactor. The reactor went critical, brought steam into the engine room, and effectively drove the submarine across the Atlantic nonstop. And no submarine had ever done anything like that. And they said, the concept works. And so they then proceeded to build the Nautilus and SSN 571, and it became operational. It's now a museum in New London, Connecticut, right by the Submarine Museum, by the sub base. And you can go aboard. You can't go back aft, but you can go aboard and see the hybrid between a nuclear sub and a diesel sub. It's quite different from the nuclear subs of today. But Rickover became, he was the father of the nuclear Navy. So he designed reactors for the Enterprise, the first nuclear aircraft carrier, as well as several variants of submarine reactors, including, the evolution that brought them up to today, where they can run for 43 years and never have to be refueled. So
crazy. And
they're producing, 230, 240 megawatts, which is equivalent to what we're calling a small modular reactor. That's what everybody wants. They all want a small modular reactor to power all these AI data centers and everything else. But it's very expensive. And that's why they're not, we haven't built any for 40 years, because they're just so expensive to build. Duke Power or Georgia Power actually built 2 new nuclear plants, but they cost a total of $35 billion and took 5 years longer to build than they had predicted. Hopefully we can do better than that with the small modular reactors and the micro reactors, but we'll see if they can be cost efficient. That's the challenge.
Well, I can see just in your face that you love doing that.
It was fun. Yeah. It was fun to be part of that, and now back here at Summit Vista and being around, we have the largest veterans group in the state. And everybody, and there aren't very many of us bubbleheads, that's what you're called, because the angle on the diesel boats was just a tube of water with a bubble in it. And so when you went down, the bubble moved, and so you were a bubblehead, okay? And there aren't many of us around, as you guys have found. You've done 70 plus interviews, and I'm the first sub, that we think anyway, probably.
For sure.
So it's fun to be part of that. And I'm also part of the USS Utah Commissioning Committee, and to tell people about the USS Utah, firsthand stuff is really quite fun.
In the Navy, you guys had some clout, I would think.
Yeah, we did. We got the best people. For instance, when I was between submarine tours, I was a company officer at the Naval Academy, and I did that because I could go to night school at George Washington and get an MBA. So if I did get out of the Navy, that was a good credential. But 1,000 graduates come out of the Naval Academy every year, and everybody, the pilots the aviation community wants them, Marine wants them, and the nuclear power wants them, and so you apply your junior year to be in the nuclear program, and you have to go to Washington, D.C. and be interviewed by the modern day Admiral Rickover, if you will. If you get accepted, you get a check for $10,000 because they need smart people to be running these nuclear subs, and we've never had a problem. I mean, think about it. We've gone through, from the 571 to the 801, what's that, 230 nuclear submarines, and we've sunk 2 of them, but we've never had a problem that caused any kind of danger to the public. And I broke my sub 3 times, the reactor 3 times in ways that had never been broken, but we always kept it safe, and we were able to figure out what had happened. But that's quite a tribute to the nuclear Navy that we can have these reactors, and not only do we have reactors, but they're maneuvering, okay, and being shocked, and they're still operating safely.
Yeah,
so it's amazing. And it's because you're getting the smart guys, okay, all the nerds, and we get paid a little bit more, and you have the incentives to do that. And your career, after you get out, when you leave the Navy, it's very promising because you're in a elite group, and people know that you're a smart guy.
Yeah. Wow.
So it was great.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you for sharing, man. What a pleasure. I had so many things I've always wanted to know about subs.
Yeah. Well, anytime. You can see how hard it is to get me talking about submarines.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Greg.